Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of the New Stack Makers, part 2 of our series with Okta, where we're talking today about securing API services. And I'm joined by my co-host, Randall Deggs, Head of Developer Advocacy at Okta. Randall, great to see you today.
What up, Alex? It's awesome to be here, man. The previous episode we recorded together was really fun, so I'm super excited to dive into API security, which is one of my all-time favorite topics.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
Oh, no, sure. No, I was just going to say, and we have a great guest, and we both know Anant. Anant Jingran is CEO at StepZen. Hello, Anant. How are you?
Hello, Alex, and hello, Randall. Great to see you. I can actually see you, even though our audience is only going to hear us.
They're lost.
Great
We
seeing
all
you
look
guys
amazing.
again.
Well, Anant, I've known you for years. You've always been one of those brilliant people in the space who I've always enjoyed talking to. So thank you so much for joining us. And Randall is like turning out to be like a podcast pro. We had a discussion last week with Mark. What's Mark's last name?
Rogers.
Mark Rogers. If you ever get the chance to meet Mark Rogers or not, I'd recommend it. Mark had some great stories and really provided some really, I thought, insightful perspectives about the role, not just of hacking, but of influence and the role that hackers have as influencers by essentially convincing people to do things, whether they want to do them or not, or just giving them the tools to do things that they could not do before. And so it was a really interesting discussion, and I think it does dovetail into our conversation today about securing API services. And Anant, do you remember those early days of Apogee when the APIs, the REST-based APIs, were becoming one of the most fascinating topics to discuss? And it's really where I really cut my teeth on learning about enterprise and learning about the role that APIs play and really learning more about developers. And they were so new and they were so fun and they were connection points. And when Twitter arrived and they basically emerged as an API, and there was just all these fascinating discussions that we'd have with you and Sam Ramsey and others. And and I think back now, wow, we weren't really talking about security. It was more just about the connectors and how those connectors were being done and how you were developing our APIs. And then it moved into documentation and discussions about the importance of documentation. And now we're at that maturity point where APIs are so predominant now that it is an issue of security. It is an issue of reliability and resilience, which is an interesting topic for us. And Randall, I want to just turn it to you and see what you'd like to first talk about with Anant as we begin this discussion.
Absolutely. So I guess first things first, Anant, just for the sake of all of our listeners out there in the world, could you give the audience a quick description of your background? Because I want to make sure they understand all the awesome things about you before I start hammering you with fun questions.
Okay, now both of you are ganging up to embarrass me, so I'll keep it really short. I am older than both Alex and Randall, which just goes to show that I've done a few more things. That's about it. So I've done in my life kind of done two things reasonably okay. One was I got to know what it means to build infrastructure for data and machine learning and others at IBM. And then second, I got to learn how to build infrastructure for APIs at Apogee. So I've done those two things. And then that's what defines me. Everything else is because of all the smart people that I'm surrounded by that help me continue to do interesting things.
So Anant, you have been in the industry a long time and you have some insane stories, I'm sure. I guess the first question I really want to ask you is, since I really got into like web development, probably back in the early 2000s, the game has changed so much. I mean, back in the day, SOAP APIs were a thing, then REST APIs were a thing. In recent years, GraphQL has become like a massive topic. I know the company you're building today has a lot to do with GraphQL. Could you just share your perspective real quick on like what you see in the industry today as being the predominant API technology, and what things you think are coming up and being bigger topics in this space in the next few years?
Awesome. So the fundamental driver for APIs is really about disaggregating your business and ensuring that you can actually have innovation that is not just driven by the four walls of your enterprise. So typically what has happened is that when people have built out their websites, or when they've built out other capabilities, partner capabilities and others, they've generally been built out by their employees and by their friends, within quotes, and everything else. With APIs, enterprises and up and coming startups got an opportunity to say, no, look, we should no longer be constrained by the innovation that our employees or our partners can do. Why can't third parties actually innovate on the stuff that we are really good at? Which means, can we disaggregate our business? Can we have components that other people can build on, so that when they bring their innovation to our capabilities, together it's kind of a win-win situation. So that concept has remained a constant. But how that concept has kind of evolved has actually fundamentally changed. And I think in some ways that change, Randall and Alex, has happened because who the recipient of that capability has changed. In the old world, when we talked about WSDL and SOAP and everything else that still exists, really you were working with partners that were very closely held partners, where you could form kind of long-standing relationship, and therefore you could expose complex interfaces, but they would invest in it in order for them to be able to do something with it. Then came the world which said, no, that by itself is all well and good and important, but really to drive this massive engine, you really want to open it up and have people to be able to self-service and sign up and leverage your capabilities. And that is where, for example, REST and REST APIs and everything else that came with it kind of really took off. And today, if you go and look at programmable web and others, there'll be like hundreds of thousands of APIs that exist that are kind of REST-based APIs. So that was the first kind of change. And then I strongly believe that the third change that's happening right now, the change of kind of GraphQL and others, it's happening because of yet another paradigm shift. And that paradigm shift really is about the importance of front-end developers and developers who drive experiences. And the developers who drive experiences are working in these new JavaScript technologies and React technologies and others. But they are driving towards this kind of complete abstraction and saying, look, we only care about the data. We don't care about how the data is produced and everything else. And GraphQL turns out to be a fantastic kind of new trend. And hopefully I'll get a chance to talk about it. That kind of enables it. But in all of those three trends, the fundamental driver has still remained the same, which is, I have something, can I have others drive innovation around it?
I think that's an awesome point. There's a few really interesting things just about APIs in general before I get into the first real question of this episode. But you're very right in the sense that APIs have expanded so much because they let people access data and perform operations and do actions from all these different areas. Maybe you have partners making requests, or developers building things directly, or consumers making requests. It can go through so many different areas. And in recent years, the way people access things using APIs have changed so much. A few years ago, it was really backend developers making requests. Nowadays, you have front-end JavaScript clients and mobile applications and all these different environments, which leads to some really interesting security considerations. I know that at your company, you've been working on some interesting security things around APIs, but just in general, how data is accessed through the different types of APIs, how they're secured, and really the ways that people can fundamentally make these operations work across the internet is absolutely fascinating. I think my next question for you is, taking security stuff into consideration, do you have any interesting stories you want to share, maybe about, what your thoughts are on the state of API security, or if you've seen any crazy incidents that you think would be fun to talk about?
Okay, of course, we have seen crazy incidents, but I'm not sure that I can kind of name or talk about all of them. But let's first say this. Look, so the purpose of the APIs really is to drive innovation. And what that means is that there is this continuous struggle between making the business succeed by driving innovation versus protecting the business to ensure that bad things don't happen. And that kind of tussle, which is, look, good things can happen, but also bad things can happen. And how do you kind of ensure that the knob is turned right, where the right balance is a very, very difficult thing to get right? On the one hand, we have got examples of Just Dial that you might have known. This is a 2015 incident where the API was left completely unsecured, right? And you'd say, why would you do that? And you'd say, come on, were the developers smoking something when they did it? And the answer is probably not. Answer was probably there was some business pressure which said, look, let's open up, let's kind of innovate on some business model. And somebody said, let's first do it with keeping it open. And then that API expanded and expanded. And eventually that led to a massive data breach, right? So on the one hand, you've got this problem, which is people really, really saying that, look, let's drive the business, and kind of exposing themselves with respect to bad things happening. And on the other hand, you see APIs today, and again, I won't name them because we work with some of them, but the APIs are so obscure and so difficult to access, and you've got to sign a 10-page document and prove that you are a legitimate business before you can even access those APIs and everything else. And therefore, they are completely tweaked towards making sure that bad things don't happen. And therefore, then they are not serving the purpose of the business, right? And so the key question really is, what I have seen almost always, Randall and Alex, is that finding that balance between doing well for the business as well as kind of protecting it is not something that people get right off the bat. And a lot of things that you see that happen because the dial has been turned incorrectly.
The dial's been turned incorrectly. And and you discuss how the dial has been turned incorrectly. And it reminds me of something I read in preparation for our discussion today about, and I think you're referring to this, how often it's internal controls that are then started to be exposed externally, and they're not treated, as external endpoints, but they're more treated as internal endpoints, but they're very much out there, and then there's that capability to then find them. And that seems to me a way that we're seeing these exploitations happen, where there's almost like this effort on the part of operations teams to become more efficient, but there's also this interesting developer story when they really want to just continue to build out, and security teams then feel like, wow, I didn't know that these endpoints were insecure. Now look what happened. But the developers then are saying, well, there's risk here. Do you think that there's a degree of risk that security teams need to be better aware of, that they need to think differently about risk management, and they need to think more about the actual capabilities that the APIs can provide? And I'm sure it comes back to the balance, but it seems like that there's a little bit of out of imbalance there in terms of just the precautionary measures that we see from security groups.
That's an awesome point, Randall, since you have been doing security for so long, I'm sure that you have got a lot of interesting perspectives to add to what Alex has said. And after that, I'll give you my views.
Yeah, so I was actually going to say I could talk about this all day, every day, because not only is it such a fun topic, which is one of the reasons why I'm so excited to do this particular recording, but it's also just so important, because I've been doing web security stuff for 12, 13 years now. And before that, I did lower level security around operating systems and things of that nature. And one of the things that's so fun about APIs, and tell me if you guys feel the same way about this, but I still have that like magical feeling, like way deep down, the first time you use an API and you get some data back and something works. Like I remember the very first time I used Twilio, I wrote a line of code and I said, okay, client.sms.send. I gave it a phone number, I gave it a message, and 2 seconds later, I had a text message on my cell phone. And I just thought, this shit right here is absolutely the future. This is so fun. And the industry is blown up. And one of the things that's fascinating about the security side is how difficult it is. So Anand, as I'm sure you can attest to firsthand, when you're building APIs, it's really fun and complicated. It's at least 10 times as complicated to secure it. I can share a story. I won't name any names, but a couple years ago, I was working with this really large customer company, and I was helping their core engineering team with some user account management setup stuff. So I was helping advise them around the architecture of the APIs they were building and how to sort of scale it and lock things down. In the process of doing that, I was playing around with their website and trying to figure out how this session management piece was working. And I noticed that they were using this third-party marketing tool to track their users. And it was just a link tag embedded in their website source code, or script tag, excuse me. So out of curiosity, because it had a custom domain name in there, I went and I clicked on the provider. I hadn't heard of them before, so I checked it out and I was like, oh, this is an interesting provider. And I did a little dig command on the domain just to see where it was pointing to. And it turns out it was pointing to an Amazon S3 bucket. So what I did is I said, oh, this is interesting. It looks like they're serving all of these assets for this website out of this Amazon S3 bucket. I just so happened that I had the Amazon command line tool installed on my computer. And so I said, I wonder if they set up the permissions on this bucket properly. So I tried to do like an AWS S3 LS command just to see what files were in there. And sure enough, I get a full dump of all the files in this public-facing CDN for this entire company. Oh. And I was like, wow, that's surprising. Then I said, okay, I'm just going to create a file on my desktop, test.txt, and I'm going to try to copy that file into the S3 bucket. There's no way they left write permissions enabled. So I try to run this copy command, and sure enough, 2 seconds later, this test.txt file is distributed on this worldwide CDN, and I'm just like freaking out, like, oh my God. So I immediately delete the file. I contact the company, I fill out, the security email address, send them a message or whatever. They ended up getting it fixed pretty quick. But the take home or the takeaway lesson of that story in my mind is that sometimes, even when you're building things, the security incidents and the attack vectors aren't things that are even obvious. Maybe the API itself is doing things right, but the resources that are being accessed through this, whether it's an S3 bucket holding the JavaScript code that can potentially be used to take down this website or whatever it is, maybe there's these little things that slip through the cracks, which is why it's such an interesting field, because there's so much complexity to it and so many different ways for things to break,
That's an awesome point. I mean, that's why, of course, you and I are developers, and so we tend to have sympathy to our own folks, but I have a lot of sympathy for developers. Because on the one hand, you will have the business people kind of saying, look, where is that API? Where's that awesome API? How can you make it simpler? Hopefully, right? And on the other hand, you've got this whole mass of stuff that you've got to worry about with respect to security. And almost always the latter, right? Again, coming back to the dial, the latter from a developer perspective says, okay, no, look, I can learn this cool tool to build that API, but oh my God, how do I kind of do all the other things that I need to do? And I think that therefore, if you kind of put the developer in the middle, you tend to say that, look, you have to be extremely sympathetic to the fact that all of these things that happen don't happen because of stupidity, right? They happen in spite of the best of intentions and in spite of the best smartness. And therefore, what is the answer kind of going forward? Because if it is happening because of stupidity, you can kind of think about, look, at some point in time, some bad things will happen, but then other people will come around it. But if they're happening in spite of it, right? What are the things that can be done? And that's why, I mean, I was just a huge fan of what you did at Stormpath, and we are learning from there. What we're doing at StepZen. That just kind of two fundamental things in my mind have to be there. One is it has to be very easy for the developer, because if the developer has to read this fat a thing to kind of take care of A, B, C, D, E, and F, okay, well, where at the same time she has to expose the API to get some business thing done or whatever it is, it ain't going to happen. And more importantly, she wouldn't know all the art and everything else associated with it, right? So you have got to kind of make it really easy. And what are some of the things that you did prior to Okta and have been doing at Okta, etc., has kind of taught me that, look, security can be made easy. Okay. And the second thing is that I'm actually also a very firm believer that the good thing that has changed over the last 2 decades is that as a service model, okay, has become fairly prevalent. And some of these things, Randall and Alex, can only be solved in kind of an as a service model, because the service provider, the cloud provider, the FUBAR, in our case, for example, the API provider, etc., can kind of bring a lot of these techniques to bear automatically, so that the developer doesn't have to worry about it, right? So to me, there are kind of these one or two things. One is putting kind of developer in the center and making sure that things are really easy for the developer. And second is as a service model, I think is the path forward, because of these kind of vectors, which are not necessarily just malicious vectors, but just kind of, did you take care of X or Y or Z, should all be taken care of because of this. Otherwise, we are on this hopeless treadmill where the business side will always be pulled back by, because every time a badness happens, I can almost guarantee you that company then does the next API much more slowly, right? And therefore, in the end, every badness is like that monkey climbing up the pole. For one step going up, it comes down 3 feet, or whatever the expression was, right? And so therefore, we have to figure out how to prevent that badness in most of the cases by making it easy and through as a service model.
You know, no one likes to be embarrassed, right? No one likes to be called out. And I think it goes back to our fears as children when we're in the schoolyard and someone makes fun of us, or you know, there's a group of kids who are like always kind of, you know, picking on a few others, right? You know, there's that kind of sense that I think we still have. And there's all kinds of things that you can do, you know, in our today's world to prevent these issues. You know, we've talked about some of them, and, you know, there's other avenues, such as, you know, how do you take care of your keys from being publicly exposed? How do you limit, you know, how do you do things such as a rate limit behavior? You know, how do you find ways to, you know, detect botnets, right? There's all kinds of ways that we could, you know, there's all kinds of solutions we could talk about. But I want to talk a little bit about something beyond that, and it really gets to the heart of Anant, where I think you're involved in talking about GraphQL. And GraphQL, I think it's been described as old wine in a new bottle, or, you know, or maybe it's something fundamentally different. And I'm wondering, how does one go about securing GraphQL APIs? What are the GraphQL APIs that you're seeing emerge, and what's different about them? What's different than the REST-based APIs, and how they have been secured in the past?
Awesome. No, fantastic point. I don't think they are old wine in new bottle at all. but obviously sometimes you can do things in the old way and in the GraphQL way, and therefore it's the same thing kind of thing. But coming back to more importantly, just like what we have talked about in the last 15, 20 minutes, sometimes with the power comes problems. So the superpower of GraphQL really is that, unlike in kind of traditional REST based calls, you make a call, and what you do is what you get back is some big blob of JSON, okay? And the call that you made and what you got back are in some way related, but then you as a developer have to kind of pull out pieces A, B, C, and D, etc., right? But the goodness of it is, so what that does is it kind of puts the additional burden on the developer. But the goodness for the person who has the API is that person is very secure that the stuff that they're sending out, okay, is the stuff that they've kind of approved of and is kind of fixed and everything else. So it's the same payload that goes on, whether you want that stuff or not want that stuff, I'm going to send that to you, right? So that's the world of REST and JSON. On the one hand, the developers have to do more work, but on the other hand, the kinds of ways in which bad questions can be asked is very, very limited. Whereas in GraphQL, what has happened is that the power of asking the question has been transferred to the developer, right? GraphQL in some ways is like SQL, that, look, we have this set of things, ask us whatever you feel like asking, and we will kind of assemble the dots and give it to you, which is awesome now from a developer perspective, right? Because she can now ask for whatever bits of information she wants. But now, from a protection purposes, it actually creates other problems, because now think about a scenario in which there's a GraphQL endpoint that allows some application to ask for, given month as a parameter, ask for products that are for sale in that month. Simple question. And in GraphQL, you can then further say, okay, give me the price of the product and the discount and how many quantities of stuff is available. All well-intentioned for the front-end developer to be able to display the products that are for sale in that month. Awesome. Okay. But guess what? GraphQL is being used in this new Jamstack world, in the world where browsers make direct calls to backend APIs. In fact, the A in Jamstack, as you all know, is about APIs. So the browsers are now making calls. And now when the browsers are making calls without something sitting in the middle, you really can't trust what's actually coming in. And what if somebody then changes the parameter from this month 2 months later? And now it comes in with a proper key and everything else. And now, because of the flexibility, you are now sending the stuff back about the products that will be on sale 2 months down the road, as opposed to the products that are on sale right now, right? And this is just a very simple thing where, by shifting the power to the developer to ask whatever they wanted, for good developers, it's goodness. But for any malicious browser and others, in this new world of Jamstack, now allows them to actually go and peek into and ask for stuff. Now, again, all of that can be protected, etc., etc. But these are kind of new vectors that can come in because we have given the power of query language all the way back. So again, this is always the perennial struggle between flexibility versus control, and GraphQL has to kind of find the balance.
I'm just going to chime in real quick and second everything Anant just said, because GraphQL is amazing for so many reasons. I think one of the big ones for me is just that, both as a service provider where you're building the API service, you have this like standard way to build it, which I think is fantastic. It really reduces like the thought and like the amount of time you have to spend architecting things, because there's a standardized way to do it with GraphQL that is just so powerful. And likewise, for the developer who ends up using your APIs, you have this standard SQL-like way to query for whatever the heck you want, which is like incredible. You know, you don't need to rely on random REST API docs for these various endpoints, or going through a million lines of code in some Python library someone hacked together, 6-7 years ago. It just really simplifies things. And on the security side of that, there's exactly like what you just said. There's so many interesting things going on. Maybe that's, do you have a JavaScript client that cannot be trusted, that needs to access a secure API? Or maybe you're in an environment where you just have this like microservice architecture. You have one server talking to another server, and they can have keys that are stored securely in environment variables or on hardware or whatever it is. Like, there's just a lot of considerations there.
One question I have for you, Randall, it relates to authentication and identity, and how that's playing a role. And one of the key challenges in Kubernetes and in microservices and container architectures is essentially what happens when you just have so much to configure, right? Where there's whole new levels of responsibility. I mean, in a Kubernetes environment, it's really, you really don't have a developer environment, right? You're using plugins and such, and so it creates one level of complexity. How do you configure all these things? And then you have a next level where you have, the question of actually who does actually manage the configurations, and then what are you actually configuring? Because there's no authentication or identity environment within Kubernetes itself. And so then you get into these issues about policy and such. And I keep thinking about Kubernetes as really as a declarative environment, and microservices as just basically loosely coupled things based upon API architectures. And I'm curious about these issues from your perspective on how identity plays a role even deeper now as we look at this next level of development involving microservices.
Yeah, it's crazy complicated is the answer. Like, so let's actually start at the beginning for the audience, because I feel like in the conversation so far, we've talked about all the problems. We got to give people some concrete info. So here's layer 0 for API security. Layer 0 is you don't do anything. So maybe you build an API service, a REST API, a GraphQL API, and you have a client that can literally just query the API, no credentials, no username, no API keys, no nothing, right? That's layer 0. That's where a lot of people are today, especially large companies that are still moving from on-premise hardware-based services into the cloud, for example. A lot of those older services were built without any sort of authentication layers in them. So that's like layer 0. Layer 1, I would say, on top of that is what, HTTP basic authentication. This is sort of the typical model developers are used to today, where, you're using an API and you have an API key, and sometimes it might be 2 keys, sometimes called an ID and a secret. AWS calls it like an access key ID and a secret access key, but basically they're just a username and a password. And the way those work is every time you make a request to an API service, you send along your username and password, and the service is going to validate that and say, okay, you can access this API, yes or no. The third layer from there is OAuth and OpenID Connect, which are sort of one and the same. And this is more of a delegated form of authorization and authentication. But the way this works is you still have a username and password, but instead of using it to authenticate against the API directly, you first talk to this authorization server and you say, hey, here's my username and password. Please give me a temporary access token that will allow me to talk to the API itself. So this authorization server is going to validate your username and password and give you back a token. Then you as a developer use this token and send that in your request to the API service to, actually, make a request to do something. And this model is really nice because now you're in a situation where you have this token. It's short-lived, so it's not going to last forever. And there's a lot of benefits to that. Like, for example, if you were to publish your username and password in a public-facing GitHub repo, for example, that could be disastrous for you because people can grab that token, they can make requests as you, whatever. But if you have this temporary token, the risk mitigation is much lower, because maybe if that gets leaked or published on the internet, or someone sniffs it when you're at Starbucks on the Wi-Fi, at least in the future when we're out of a pandemic and can actually go to a Starbucks again. That would be amazing. But like,
Yeah.
you know, that OAuth model really helps reduce risk and is what I would consider layer 2. Then you have layer 3, which is something that I would consider Anant to be working on, which is where you're trying to build really innovative, is it innovative or innovative? Whatever. Innovative solutions where you have a trusted API and you're trying to make it available to clients that you may not be able to trust. Like Anant was saying, the Jamstack world is huge right now. People are building these front-end apps that are highly dynamic, talking to many different APIs. And how do you secure those properly? You know, like you can't embed a username and password in your client-side JavaScript code because someone can just right-click, view source, and find it. It's the same problem a lot of mobile apps have. You can't embed an API key in a mobile app, ship it to an app store, because the security researcher could download the app, you know, reverse engineer it and pull your keys out of there. And so it's really risky. So then there's that layer 3 stuff, which is all of these really interesting and emerging patterns and best practices for helping keep things secure in really insecure environments. And I think, I guess that's a little lesson of the day, but I think Anant, it would be really interesting for you to just quickly talk about what you're working on at StepZen as well, because I think some of the problems you guys are trying to solve are not only just extremely helpful to developers, but like sort of on the bleeding edge of this stuff. So maybe you could quickly talk about what you're working on at StepZen and how the audience can get involved in that if they want to check it out.
Awesome. Hey, thank you. And I think that so obviously, as I kind of briefly mentioned, we are trying to build for the front-end developers a mechanism to easily self-service a GraphQL API out of all the backends. And the real purpose behind it is to ensure that the front-end developers are not waiting in line for the backend developers to actually do the right things for them, so that they can actually build awesome developer experiences. So the model really is to reduce the friction for the front-end developers, and you can go check us out on StepZen. But as Randall and I have been discussing throughout this podcast, is that anything that kind of reduces the friction has a chance of reducing the friction so much that it actually then exposes it. And therefore you start to think about, okay, look, this is good. The front-end developer can easily self-provision an API and hide all the keys related to backend configuration. But now what are the new vectors of exposure that come about? And just like Randall talked about level 0, 1, 2, and 3, we have been thinking about what does it mean in this kind of self-service, self-provisioning GraphQL way. And I've kind of given hints to you about all of them. But there's one last thing in that level 3 that I want to just talk a bit about, which is going back to the example that I talked about with respect to that products that are available in this particular month, that in the end, it turns out that the real power for a front-end developer comes when the code sits in two places. It is either JavaScript code in the browser, okay, or it is a backend API stuff. Anything else is just friction. Anything else is just friction. If you have to run a server, it's a friction. If you've got to write logic with respect to authentication or authorization, it's friction. If you've got to do some access controls and do some checking on domains and everything else, it's friction. So the key question that we are trying to solve in the world of StepZen is, where can we reduce that friction? So I'll give you an example. Weather API is a very common API that a lot of people would love to use. And there are many weather providers out there, Randall. There's Open Weather Map, there's AccuWeather, etc., etc. But they all come with a key that is attached to your credit card. So as you make calls to AccuWeather, you end up being billed on some meter, which says once you exceed 3,000 calls in a month, then $10 more get charged against you, etc., etc. So the key itself is a very, very important asset that you want to protect. Yet you want frictionless code sitting in the browser or code in AccuWeather API how do you kind of solve that problem for that key? Now, it so happens that there are certain APIs that have been constructed to be able to solve that problem. Stripe has solved that problem. Twilio has solved that problem. Snipcart has solved that problem. Algolia has solved the problem. But there are hundreds of thousands of APIs that still have not solved this problem of how can a browser call them in any secured way. And this is one of the things that we're trying to do at StepZen in the context of GraphQL API. How do we ensure that the GraphQL interface system that we have can ensure that there nothing sits between the browser and that GraphQL interface?
So to reduce the friction.
Reduce the friction and basically enable them to call the APIs, okay, that they can't call today without putting some server in the middle. Exactly right.
Well, this has been such fun. It's been another fascinating conversation on APIs and their continued evolution. And I want to thank Randall Deggs. Randall, thank you for being co-host again on the New Stack Makers.
Absolutely. And Anant, thank you so much for being our special guest. It's been awesome talking to you.
No, it's an absolute honor that you even considered me for this. It just there's an expression that I used to use. It warms the cockles of my heart. I don't know whether that's an expression that people understand in this country, but we used to use it. But thank you very much for giving me the time and for this fascinating conversation. I now have learned a layering thing that I didn't know before, Randall, and I got to see Alex not only ask very interesting questions, but I got to see his new fedora that I had not seen in a long time. So there's been a win-win-win for all of us, I hope.
Listen to more episodes of the New Stack Makers at thenewstack.io/podcast. Please rate and review us on iTunes, like us on YouTube, and follow us on SoundCloud. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.